They laughed at my flood wall for almost a year. Then one Friday evening, after 11 minutes of rain, the same neighbors who called it the ugliest thing in the subdivision were standing knee-deep in water, pounding on my front door, begging me to save their basements. The funny part wasn't that I refused to help right away. The funny part was that I had been protecting those houses for months without any of them even realizing it. My name is Ethan Mercer. I'm 42 years old, and I'm a hydraulic engineer living in a small riverfront neighborhood outside Cedar Bluff, Kentucky. I don't have the biggest house on the street. I don't drive the newest truck. And I don't spend Saturday mornings comparing lawn fertilizer with my neighbors. I bought my place because I loved the river, the quiet mornings, and the fact that I could hear birds instead of traffic. Unfortunately, when you buy the lowest property in a hillside subdivision, you inherit something nobody else wants to think about: gravity. Water doesn't care how expensive your house is. It doesn't care whether you have marble countertops or a 6-car garage. Water always follows physics. The people living uphill never understood that because every heavy rain ended exactly the same way. Their yards drained perfectly while my backyard became a shallow lake. During my first year there, I replaced drywall twice, rebuilt one retaining wall, lost nearly every tool inside my workshop, and watched $20,000 disappear because the original developer had ignored almost every recommendation in the county drainage report. I discovered that during a routine permit search at the county engineering office, the clerk actually looked at me over her glasses and said, "You're the first homeowner who's ever asked to see these files." When I opened the original plans, everything suddenly made sense. The subdivision had been designed around a natural drainage channel that crossed what later became my property. Instead of building a proper retention system, the developer simply counted on the lowest lot absorbing the overflow forever. That lowest lot eventually became mine. I remember sitting in my truck that afternoon, staring at those drawings, thinking I had two choices. I could spend the next 20 years complaining every time it rained, or I could solve the problem myself. Engineers aren't famous for complaining. We usually just build something. So I hired a structural concrete contractor, designed a reinforced flood barrier with adjustable drainage gates, submitted every drawing to the county, obtained every permit, passed every inspection, and spent nearly $50,000 creating a system that redirected runoff safely around my foundation before releasing it back into the natural watershed downstream. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't pretty. It looked exactly like what it was: infrastructure. The first major storm came 2 months later. My basement stayed dry. So did every house uphill. Nobody noticed because when engineering works, nothing happens. Success is invisible. Then summer arrived. Lawns turned green. Memories faded, and eventually, people forgot there had ever been flooding at all. That's when our HOA president decided my wall had become his personal mission. His name wasn't Gerald. Around here, everyone knew him as Richard Holloway. 63 years old, retired commercial developer, owner of the biggest house in the neighborhood, and a man who genuinely believed every opinion he had deserved an audience. Richard never yelled. That would have been too ordinary. Instead, he smiled while insulting people. The kind of smile that made you feel like he was already imagining the conversation he'd tell at the country club afterward. During the May HOA meeting, he stood up holding a laser pointer like he was presenting evidence in a criminal trial. A photo of my property appeared on the projector behind him. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, grinning, "this bunker has no place in a luxury community." People chuckled. Someone actually clapped. Richard kept going. "Property values matter. Appearances matter. We can't allow one homeowner to build industrial structures because he's afraid of a little rain." I almost laughed at that because the irony was incredible. The only reason his own basement had stayed dry all year was because of the structure he was mocking. I calmly explained the engineering reports, the county approvals, the drainage calculations. Nobody cared. Richard interrupted me halfway through and said, "Nobody here paid to attend an engineering lecture." More laughter. Then came the vote. 6 board members. 6 uphill homes. 6 people who had unknowingly benefited from my system every single time clouds rolled in. They approved a violation notice on the spot. $500 per day until the wall was removed. Richard folded the paperwork neatly, walked over, handed it to me with another smile, and quietly said, "Sometimes neighbors have to make sacrifices for the community." I looked at him for a long second before answering. "Funny," I said. "I've been doing exactly that for over a year." He frowned because he didn't understand what I meant. None of them did. I folded the notice, slipped it into my jacket pocket, thanked everyone for their time, and walked out without another word. They thought my silence meant I had lost. In reality, I had just decided it was finally time to stop protecting people who had no idea they were being protected. Back at home, I unlocked my office, spread every engineering drawing across my desk, pulled up the latest weather forecasts, and noticed something that made my stomach tighten. A slow-moving storm system was expected to stall directly over our valley by the end of the week, bringing several inches of rain in just a couple of hours. I leaned back in my chair, stared through the window toward the concrete wall everyone hated so much, and quietly asked myself one question that would change everything. What happens when the people laughing at the engineer finally have to meet the laws of physics on their own? By Wednesday afternoon, the forecast stopped looking like one of those weather reports everybody jokes about and started looking like something every engineer quietly respects. The National Weather Service upgraded the alert twice in the same day. Local news stations were suddenly using phrases like historic rainfall potential, and my phone kept buzzing with weather notifications that most of my neighbors probably swiped away without reading. I didn't panic. Panic never solves engineering problems. It only creates human ones. Instead, I walked outside with a flashlight, inspected every hinge on the drainage gates, lubricated the locking pins, checked each pressure sensor, and tested the manual controls one last time. Everything functioned exactly as designed. Standing there with muddy boots and a wrench in my hand, I realized how strange the whole situation had become. 12 months earlier, I had built this system to protect my own home. Over time, it had quietly become the reason half the neighborhood stayed dry, and somehow I had ended up being punished for it. My attorney, Melissa Grant, had warned me about this after the HOA meeting. She looked through every permit, every survey, every county approval, every easement description, then leaned back in her chair and asked one simple question. "Ethan, are they paying you to provide flood protection?" I laughed. "Not a dime." She nodded. "Then legally speaking, your system exists to protect your property. If neighboring properties benefit, that's incidental. You have absolutely no legal obligation to continue providing that benefit if doing so requires operating private infrastructure on their behalf." I remember asking, "So if I stop operating the gates?" She answered without hesitation, "As long as you don't redirect water unnaturally or damage someone else's property, you're allowed to stop providing a voluntary service on your own land." Those words stayed with me. Stop providing a voluntary service. That wasn't revenge. That was simply deciding I wasn't going to subsidize people who fined me $500 a day for helping them. Thursday evening, Richard drove by my house twice. I could tell because his black SUV always crawled past with that same slow, deliberate speed, like he wanted me to notice he was inspecting something. Around sunset, he actually stopped beside my driveway, rolled down his window and shouted, "Still got time to tear that thing down before Monday." I smiled and waved. "Still got time to withdraw the fines." He laughed. "We'll see who folds first." Then he drove away. I watched his taillights disappear around the curve and quietly whispered, "I think we will." Friday arrived heavy and humid, the kind of summer day where the air feels too thick to breathe and every bird seems unusually quiet. Around 4 o'clock, dark clouds swallowed the sunlight. By 5, thunder rolled continuously somewhere upriver. At 5:38, my weather station recorded the first drops. I finished my coffee, grabbed my rain jacket, and walked toward the control cabinet built into the inside corner of my flood wall. Most people imagine the whole system was some complicated automated machine. It wasn't. The beauty of good engineering is simplicity. 6 reinforced drainage gates, stainless steel actuators, manual override levers. Gravity did almost all the work. I unlocked the cabinet, placed my hand on the first lever, and hesitated for maybe 3 seconds. Not because I doubted the law, not because I feared the HOA, because I genuinely liked most of my neighbors. Richard wasn't the entire community. Families lived up there. Kids rode bicycles. Retired couples watered flowers every morning. For a brief moment, I considered leaving everything exactly as it had been. Then I remembered standing in that HOA meeting while 6 people laughed as they voted to fine me for protecting them. I remembered Richard calling years of engineering work an eyesore. I remembered the violation notice still sitting on my kitchen counter. One by one, I closed every gate. Metal clicked into place with a sound so ordinary nobody would ever believe it could change an entire neighborhood. I locked the cabinet, slipped the key into my pocket, and went inside. Rain intensified almost immediately. At 6:15, water poured off rooftops in silver sheets. My security cameras showed streams racing downhill exactly as the watershed maps predicted. Instead of entering my controlled drainage channels, runoff followed the original terrain toward the upper retaining slopes surrounding the larger homes. 6:28. The first notification appeared on the neighborhood social media page. Anyone else's backyard flooding? 6:33. Another post. Storm drains backing up near Holloway Court. 6:38. Someone uploaded a picture of water covering their patio furniture. I said nothing. I simply watched. At 6:44, my outdoor cameras showed water collecting against Richard's decorative stone landscaping. His expensive retaining wall had always relied on overflow entering my drainage network. Without that release point, water behaved exactly the way gravity intended. At 6:48, headlights filled my driveway. Richard jumped out wearing loafers already soaked through, yelling before he even reached the porch. I opened the front door but stayed inside. "Open those damn gates," he shouted. "Our basements are flooding." I looked past him toward the street. Water was flowing exactly where the county map said it naturally would. "Good evening, Richard. This isn't funny." I didn't say it was. "You're causing property damage." "Actually," I replied calmly, "I'm protecting my property." His face turned bright red. "You built that wall." "Correct. You changed the drainage. With county approval. Open it." I disappeared into my office for a moment and returned carrying a thick blue binder. I handed it to him. "What's this?" "Engineering report. Watershed analysis. County permits. Inspection certificates. Everything you laughed at last month." Rain hammered the porch roof while he flipped through pages he clearly didn't understand. Finally, he looked up. "I don't care about paperwork." "That's unfortunate," I answered, "because paperwork usually decides these conversations." Before he could respond, another SUV screeched into my driveway. Then another. Patricia Dawson from Lot 9 climbed out carrying a flashlight. Behind her came Mark Ellison, whose finished basement contained a custom home theater. Both looked terrified. "Ethan," Patricia said, almost pleading, "please, water's coming under the back door." I sighed because, unlike Richard, Patricia had always been polite. She simply followed the board's decisions without asking many questions. "I'm sorry you're dealing with that. Can you help us?" Richard interrupted before I could answer. "He's going to help because he has to." I slowly shook my head. "No, Richard, I don't." Silence hung between us except for the rain. Then I reached into the binder again and removed a single document. "Melissa suggested I prepare this in case today happened." Richard grabbed it immediately. At the top it read Private Drainage Infrastructure Access Agreement. He laughed after reading the first paragraph. "You can't be serious." "Keep reading." His smile disappeared. "Annual infrastructure maintenance fee, $108,000, prepaid, 10-year minimum term, shared liability waiver, mandatory engineering approval for landscaping changes within 200 feet of the drainage corridor, annual inspections, no HOA authority over the system." Richard stared at me like I had started speaking another language. "You trying to extort us?" "No," I replied quietly. "I'm offering professional flood management services. The same services you've been receiving for free." Patricia took the agreement from his hands and read silently for almost a minute. Finally, she whispered, "He's actually charging less than what flood restoration will cost." Nobody answered her because everyone standing there already knew she was right. My phone rang. "Melissa." I answered on speaker. "Everything okay?" she asked. "My driveway is full of neighbors." "Have they threatened you?" "Not yet." "Good. Remember, don't negotiate emotionally. Let them make the next move." Richard heard every word. He stepped closer until we were almost face to face. "You planned this?" I met his eyes without raising my voice. "No, I planned for rain. You planned on me working for free forever." He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, a loud cracking sound echoed from somewhere uphill. Everyone turned. One of the decorative landscape walls beside Richard's backyard had partially collapsed under the pressure of trapped water. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The only sound was rushing runoff and distant thunder. Richard looked back at me. And for the first time since I'd met him, there wasn't arrogance in his expression anymore. There was uncertainty, maybe even fear. He finally asked, much quieter this time, "What happens if we don't sign?" I looked toward the storm, then back at the flooded street, and answered with complete honesty. "Then the water keeps following the path nature always intended. And tonight is probably just the beginning." The rain finally slowed sometime after midnight, but nobody in Riverside Ridge slept much that night. Flashing emergency lights reflected off wet pavement until nearly 2 in the morning. Restoration trucks crawled through the subdivision before sunrise. and every basement uphill smelled like soaked drywall and wet insulation. Mine didn't. My workshop was dry. My foundation was dry. My flood wall stood exactly where it had always stood, silent and unmoving, doing absolutely nothing except protecting the property it had been designed to protect. Saturday morning, I made coffee, stepped onto my back patio, and looked across the neighborhood. It felt strangely peaceful despite the damage. That's the thing about storms. Eventually, they always stop. Human pride usually takes a little longer. Around 9:30, my phone rang. It wasn't Richard this time. It was Patricia. Her voice sounded exhausted. "Ethan, would you at least meet with us before lawyers make this even worse?" I paused for a moment before answering. "I'll listen." 2 hours later, we gathered inside the small clubhouse where the same board had voted to fine me only a few weeks earlier. The atmosphere couldn't have been more different. Nobody smiled. Nobody whispered jokes. The projector that once displayed pictures of my flood wall now displayed photographs of flooded basements, collapsed landscaping, ruined flooring, and insurance estimates that seemed to climb every time someone opened another email. One family alone faced nearly $90,000 in restoration costs because mold mitigation had already begun. Richard walked in last. He looked older than I remembered, not because of one storm, but because confidence disappears quickly when reality refuses to negotiate. He carried a folder under his arm and, for the first time since we'd met, walked directly toward me without an audience to impress. "I'd like to apologize," he said quietly. I didn't interrupt him. I confused appearance with value. "I thought your wall was hurting this neighborhood when it was actually protecting it. That's on me." It wasn't the dramatic apology people imagine in movies. It was awkward, uncomfortable, painfully human. And honestly, I respected that more. Melissa sat beside me and slid the infrastructure agreement across the table. This time, nobody laughed. Instead, they asked questions. Good questions. About maintenance schedules, liability, emergency inspections, future drainage improvements. The conversation finally sounded like adults trying to solve a problem instead of a popularity contest. By late afternoon, every homeowner had voted, not 6 board members. Every homeowner. The agreement passed by an overwhelming margin. The HOA withdrew every violation, canceled every fine, reimbursed my legal expenses, and signed a 10-year maintenance contract that paid annually in advance. More importantly, the board amended its governing documents so no future president could interfere with county-approved engineering or critical infrastructure again without independent professional review. Richard insisted on reading that amendment himself during the next community meeting. Then, before sitting down, he looked across the room and said something I'll probably never forget. The most expensive mistake we made wasn't underestimating the storm. It was underestimating the person who understood it. 3 days later, I unlocked the control cabinet, opened all 6 drainage gates, and watched water begin flowing through the channels again. Within hours, the remaining standing water disappeared from every uphill property. Nothing magical happened. No dramatic music played. Physics simply resumed doing what physics has always done. Today, people driving through our neighborhood barely notice the flood wall. Kids ride bicycles past it. Landscapers trim around it. New homeowners assume it has always been there because essential infrastructure usually becomes invisible once people understand why it exists. Every once in a while, someone asks why the HOA pays for maintenance on a structure sitting entirely on private property. I usually smile and tell them, because experience is a very effective teacher. Then I leave the rest of the story for someone else to tell. Looking back, I don't think this was ever really about concrete or drainage gates or engineering reports. It was about something much simpler. Too many people assume that if someone is quietly solving a problem, that work must not have much value. They only notice its importance after it disappears. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do isn't getting even. It's simply allowing people to experience the consequences of taking your effort for granted. I never flooded anyone's home. I never redirected water. I never broke the law. I simply stopped giving away something valuable to people who insisted it had no value at all. Ironically, after everything that happened, my flood wall became the one structure every homeowner wanted to protect. Funny how quickly an eyesore becomes critical infrastructure once people understand what it's actually doing. So now I'm curious what you think. If you had been in my position, would you have opened the gates the moment your neighbors came knocking? Or would you have done exactly what I did and waited until respect came before free labor? Was Richard simply protecting property values the way an HOA president should? Or did his own pride create a disaster that never had to happen? Let me know where you stand in the comments because stories like this always split people right down the middle. And if you've ever watched someone dismiss your knowledge until they desperately needed it, share your experience below. I'd really like to read it.